It was supposed to be just another family dinner, but instead, it became the night I realized how far I had drifted from the people I love most. I can still see the table set under the glow of the chandelier, the silver polished until it sparkled, the glasses catching the light like stars. Everyone seemed so at ease, laughing, trading stories about their jobs, their vacations, the next big thing they were chasing. And there I sat, tucked away at the end of the table, smoothing the folds of my simple dress as though that small gesture might keep me from disappearing altogether. I had brought a pie, one I had baked that morning with the same care I'd always put into feeding my family. But sitting there, next to glossy cakes from the best bakery in town, my pie looked plain, almost old-fashioned. Nobody touched it. Forks clinked against porcelain. Hands reached for everything else, and I sat there with my palms damp against my knees, pretending I was already full. It was my daughter-in-law who delivered the words that still echo in me like a bell tolling. She leaned across the table, her hair pulled tight, her voice light and polished, and told me that sometimes I was just useless at these dinners, that it was sweet that I tried. Everyone laughed politely, as if unsure whether to join in or to hide behind their napkins. My son's face tensed for a moment, but he said nothing, and in that silence, my heart sank. I held my back straight, pressing the napkin hard into my lap, as though if I held tight enough, I could keep myself together. I wanted to vanish. I wanted the ground beneath me to open and swallow me whole. Because what could be worse than being dismissed in front of everyone by the very person who had married my son? But I did not cry. I did not shout. I smiled through the burn in my cheeks and told myself to survive that moment quietly, because I refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing me break. When the night ended, coats gathered and guests spilled out the door in laughter. I stood by the entryway, a polite ghost. My son kissed me distractedly, his eyes already on his phone, and she gave me that practiced smile of hers that never reached her eyes. And then I stepped into the cold air, walked to my car, and drove away through the quiet streets. That drive home was when the truth settled over me. In my own son's house, I had become an outsider. My love, my years, my presence, they meant little against the glitter of money and the sharpness of appearances. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, the city lights blurring in my eyes, and I knew something had shifted. This was no longer just about a dinner, or even a cruel remark. It was about the respect that had slipped away from me without anyone noticing but me. And as I pulled into my driveway, the silence of my small home waiting for me, I realized this story was not only about that night. It was about everything that had led me there, the years, the sacrifices, the choices I had made in the name of family. That is where I need to begin next, with the life I gave, the things I carried, and the history that shaped me into the woman I am today. When I think back on my life, it feels like flipping through pages of a worn photo album, the kind where the corners curl and fingerprints linger on the gloss. I see myself as a young bride, barely 20, wearing a dress I sewed by hand because we couldn't afford much more. I see my husband, strong and full of plans, standing beside me with his arm draped around my shoulder, as though the whole world was ours to claim. For years, I believed it was. We didn't have much, but we had determination. I worked long days as a school secretary, filing papers and answering phones, while he built his small contracting business from scratch. There were weeks we ate beans 3 nights in a row, just so we could save for a down payment on our first little house. But we made it through because we believed in the future we were building. When the children came, my life became a patchwork of sacrifices stitched together by love. I remember nights rocking my son to sleep while my daughter was sick in the next room. I remember walking to work in the snow so they could have bus fare. Every decision I made, every dollar stretched, every dream postponed was for them. My quilt, the one folded neatly at the end of my bed even now, carries those years in every stitch. I pieced it together from scraps of fabric I couldn't bear to throw away, bits of old-school uniforms, my daughter's first Sunday dress, even a corner of my husband's work shirt. When I run my hand over it, I feel my life's story in those threads. But the hardest memories are not of poverty or struggle. They are of watching the children I raised forget those sacrifices, dismissing them as if they were nothing more than quaint stories of the past. I see it in the way my daughter-in-law smirks when I talk about making meals from scratch, or how my son waves off my advice with the distracted flick of his hand. They don't see the years that quilt represents. They only see an old woman who doesn't fit their polished world. And yet, even as I speak these words, I know something they don't. Beneath the wrinkles and gray hair is a woman who has weathered storms far worse than their rejection. I built a life with my bare hands. I endured loss, illness, and sleepless nights, and still stood tall. They may believe I am fragile, but they are mistaken. Because if there is one thing I've learned, it is this: being underestimated can be the greatest advantage of all. And soon enough, they would give me reasons to prove just how strong I still am. As the weeks passed after that dinner, I started to notice a shift I could no longer ignore. It wasn't just one cruel remark. It was the pattern that followed, the steady drip of exclusion and subtle disrespect that wore at me like water-carving stone. Invitations to gatherings arrived later and later. Sometimes not at all, and I'd only learn of the events afterward, when I saw photos posted online. Smiling faces, raised glasses, and my grandson caught in the middle of it all, his little smile, shining bright, but without me there to witness it. At first, I told myself I was imagining things, that perhaps life had simply grown busy for them. But the excuses no longer added up. My daughter-in-law seemed to treat me less like family and more like an inconvenience to be managed. My presence was tolerated at best, but often it felt like she was trying to erase me from their lives altogether. The small requests turned into bigger ones. My son had asked months ago if I might let his wife use my credit card for emergencies. Foolishly, I agreed, wanting to show trust and keep harmony. But soon, the charges began to grow. It started with children's clothes, then trips to salons, then dinners at restaurants I'd never heard of. The numbers on the statements stared back at me in black and white. Each line, another reminder that my generosity was being twisted into something else. I tried to speak up once, gently, suggesting perhaps some of the purchases weren't necessary. My words were brushed aside with the same practiced ease as crumbs swept off a table. And there I was again, silenced, made to feel as though my concerns were nothing but the ramblings of someone out of touch. Yet my heart wouldn't rest. I started to keep the statements, slipping them into a folder, almost without realizing why. And then, one late night, I noticed something that turned my unease into icy dread. Among the charges was a payment not for groceries or a child's doctor visit, but for a consultation with a financial planner. The name was unfamiliar, but the notation beside it made my stomach twist. Estate review. My estate. My property. I sat there at my kitchen table, glasses sliding down my nose, staring at that word over and over. Estate. What right did they have to be meeting with strangers about my affairs? I had never agreed to that. And then it struck me, the papers I had signed months earlier, the ones my daughter-in-law had placed in front of me so casually. She had told me they were updates for my son's insurance policy. But had I really read them carefully? My memory blurred, but I remembered the way she guided my pen to certain lines, urging me to sign quickly. That was the moment the veil lifted. What I had dismissed as thoughtlessness was something darker. This wasn't just about being excluded from dinners or mocked for being old-fashioned. This was about control. This was about money. A rush of heat filled my chest, not from shame anymore, but from indignation. They had underestimated me, assuming I wouldn't notice, wouldn't question, wouldn't fight. But I had noticed, and for the first time, I wasn't just hurt, I was suspicious. Suspicion has a way of sharpening the mind, and mine, though weathered with years, still knew how to cut through lies when it needed to. I didn't yet know the full scope of their plan, but I knew enough they were scheming, and I was no longer safe in my own silence. That realization lit something inside me. I thought I had lost the will not just to endure, but to act. And from that night forward, I began to prepare quietly, determined to turn their underestimation into the very tool that would protect me. The night I discovered those financial charges, I didn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table until dawn, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the house, a stack of papers spread out before me. For years, I had let others make me believe I was fragile, someone to be handled gently, to be kept out of the way. But as I sat there, glasses perched on the end of my nose and a pen in my hand, I felt the familiar spark of the woman I used to be, the woman who managed a household, who balanced a budget down to the last dollar, who kept records for a school full of impatient teachers and demanding parents. I began to organize every receipt, every statement, every piece of paper that bore my signature. I pulled them together into neat stacks, marking dates and circling amounts. The fog of grief and humiliation lifted, replaced by clarity. I realized they thought of me as naive, someone too tired to notice. But the truth was, I had always noticed everything. I had just chosen grace over confrontation. Not anymore. As I pored over those papers, I began to trace a pattern, like threads in a web. Payments that matched meetings, signatures that didn't look quite like mine. And slowly, an image emerged. They were trying to take what little security I had left, what I had worked decades to build, my land, my home, my savings. It wasn't enough for them to dismiss me as useless. They wanted to strip me of everything. But here's the thing, they had made one crucial mistake. In their eagerness, they had left evidence. And evidence is something I know how to hold on to. I copied every questionable document, scanned them, and stored them where no one could reach. And for the first time in months, I felt something stir in me control. That week, I also began to reach out quietly, carefully. I thought of the people from my past, the ones who still remembered me not as a frail widow, but as someone capable and resourceful. A former colleague who had become a paralegal. An old friend from church whose son worked at the county clerk's office. I did not share everything. Not yet. But I tested the waters, asked careful questions, and the answers came back clearer than I dared hope. The law, though tangled and slow, could be an ally if I armed myself properly. And I wasn't alone. I still had allies, and I still had a sharp mind. That was the second revelation, the second twist in this nightmare. They thought they had cornered me, but in their arrogance, they had shown me exactly where their weaknesses were. I was no longer the silent, discarded figure at the end of the dinner table. I was the woman at the kitchen desk at 2 a.m, drawing battle lines with ink and paper. And I knew then that the day was coming soon when they would make their move, bold and final. What they didn't realize was that I would be ready. The moment came sooner than I expected. One evening, just after 7, there was a knock at my door. My daughter-in-law stood there, dressed neatly, a folder of papers tucked under her arm, her smile thin as glass. She didn't bother with pleasantries. She told me it was time to make things official, that for my own good and for the sake of the family, I should sign some documents she had prepared. Her tone was sweet, but her eyes were sharp, watching me as though I were prey too tired to run. Inside, my stomach knotted, but on the outside, I softened my voice, lowered my shoulders, and let my hands tremble just a little. I played the part she expected, the weary old woman, too overwhelmed to resist. She laid the papers on my kitchen table, sliding them toward me like a dealer pushing cards across felt. My name was printed neatly at the top of each page. The words blurred at first, but I steadied my glasses and pretended to read, nodding slowly, even murmuring that perhaps it was best to simplify things. What she didn't know was that my phone, set carefully on the edge of the table, was recording everything, every word, every coaxing phrase, every carefully rehearsed lie. She spoke about protecting my future, about ensuring Tyler's security, about how my son was too busy to handle the details. The more she spoke, the clearer her intentions became. Not family, not love, but control, greed, and entitlement. When I asked a question, feigning confusion, she grew impatient, pointing to the signature line with increasing urgency. I let my pen hover, as though I might give in. But just before I signed, I tilted my head, acting as though I needed clarification. That gave me the chance to capture her final slip and admission that once I signed, everything I owned would be in her hands. She said it with pride, not realizing she had walked right into my trap. I set the pen down gently, folding my hands in my lap. I thanked her for caring, told her I needed just one night to think it over. She hid her frustration behind a brittle smile, gathered her papers, and left. The moment the door closed, I locked it and pressed stop on the recorder. My hands shook, not from weakness, but from the surge of adrenaline. I had what I needed: proof, undeniable and clear. They had thought I would crumble under pressure. Instead, I let them reveal themselves. That night, as I backed up the recording onto a drive and tucked it safely away, I felt the shift deep inside me. The fear that had weighed me down for months began to loosen. I was no longer cornered. I was prepared. They had made their bold move, but I had turned it back on them. And now, with evidence in hand, the path ahead was clear. The time for justice was coming, and I was ready to meet it head on. The day of reckoning came quietly, without the drama my daughter-in-law probably imagined for herself. It was not in some grand courtroom or in front of flashing cameras. It was in a modest office where the weight of the truth finally bore down on her. I had given my evidence, every receipt, every forged signature, every word from that recorded conversation. The attorney I had quietly consulted presented it neatly, one page after another, each document stacking higher against her carefully constructed lies. She had expected to walk into that room with power, with control, with me meekly signing away what was mine. Instead, she faced a wall of undeniable proof that she had deceived and manipulated. Not only me, but my son as well. I will never forget the look in her eyes when the realization set in. The smile slipped, the confidence drained, and for the first time, I saw her as she truly was, desperate and small. My son sat there too, silent, his head in his hands as the truth unraveled. It broke my heart to see him crushed by the betrayal, but in a way, it freed him as well. He could no longer deny what she had done. The legal consequences began immediately. The documents she had pushed on me were invalidated, and her access to my accounts was cut off. Soon after, charges of fraud were filed. She tried to argue, to twist the story, but her own words, captured in my kitchen, spoke louder than anything she could claim. The very arrogance that made her careless became the rope she used to tie her own noose. And me, I walked out of that office lighter than I had felt in years. I had not only protected what was mine, but I had reclaimed the dignity they had tried to strip away. The house that felt so lonely before now felt like a fortress of survival. Every wall held the echoes of my strength, every corner a reminder that I had refused to surrender. Justice, for me, was not only in the legal victories, but in the quiet return of peace. To sit once more at my kitchen table, quilt folded neatly at my side, tea steaming in my cup, and know that I had not been erased. I was still here. I had endured. And as the dust settled, I found myself thinking less about the betrayal and more about what it had taught me. Looking back now, I realized this journey was never just about betrayal or even justice. It was about rediscovering who I truly am. For so long, I let others convince me that age had dimmed my strength, that I should step quietly into the background and let life pass me by. But the truth is, resilience doesn't fade, it deepens. Every hardship I endured prepared me for the moment when I needed to stand tall again. I learned that trust is precious, but it must be guarded with wisdom. I learned that silence is not weakness, but sometimes the space where clarity grows. And most of all, I learned that being underestimated can be a gift. When people believe you are powerless, they reveal their truest selves. And in that moment, you discover the power you still carry. I am no longer the woman who sat at the end of the dinner table, shrinking beneath someone else's shadow. I am the woman who faced betrayal and found strength where even I thought it had disappeared. That is what I carry forward, and it is what I hope you carry too, that no matter your age, no matter your scars, your voice and your worth matter. If my story has touched you, I invite you to share yours in the comments. Like this video. Share it with someone who may need encouragement, and subscribe so we can keep reminding one another that strength lives in all of us, even in the moments we feel forgotten.